Captain Reed couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The world seemed to blur around him, as though reality itself was starting to warp. They had been sent on a routine mission, a dangerous but ordinary task, or so they had thought. They were soldiers, trained to handle the unthinkable, to face down death itself. But this? This was something else. As the man, who had only moments ago been shot, continued to walk ahead of them, it was as if he was no longer bound by the same rules that governed the rest of the world. The soldiers, still in shock from the inexplicable scene, found themselves hesitating, unsure of how to proceed. Every step they took felt heavier than the last. "Sir." Private Harris spoke up again, his voice trembling. "This is insane. We shot him point blank. He's not human. How is this possible?" Reed was about to respond when the man turned his head just slightly, his eyes meeting theirs. There was no anger in them, no fear. Just an unsettling calm. "You think you understand death," the man said, his voice eerily soft, yet somehow carrying over the desert. "But you haven't even begun to understand what it means to truly die." Reed's grip on his weapon tightened. Something deep inside told him that these words weren't just some cryptic ramblings of a man who had lost his mind. There was something profound here, something that felt far older and more dangerous than any of them had prepared for. The man spoke again, but this time, it wasn't directed at the soldiers. It was as if he was speaking to something unseen, something far beyond their comprehension. "The world is broken," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "And it has been for a long time. Your wars, your struggles, they are just distractions. The real battle has yet to begin." Reed's mind raced. What was he saying? "What do you mean? What battle? What do you want from us?" The man didn't answer. Instead, he continued walking, his pace steady as if the weight of the universe itself was insignificant to him. Reed found himself at a crossroads. He could turn back, call for extraction, and report this as a failed mission. Or, he could follow the man, step into the unknown, and risk everything on the possibility that there was something greater at play. His team exchanged uncertain glances, but none of them moved to stop the man. It was as if some unseen force was urging them forward, compelling them to follow. Reluctantly, Reed nodded. "Move out. Stay sharp." The team followed, their footsteps crunching on the dry desert ground, as they ventured deeper into a landscape that grew more alien with every passing minute. The air felt heavier, like the weight of centuries was bearing down upon them. The desert shifts. As they walked further, the landscape began to change. What had once been a barren wasteland of sand and rock gradually gave way to something stranger. The desert itself seemed to ripple, as if the ground beneath them was alive. The horizon shimmered with an unsettling heat, distorting their vision. "Sir, what's happening?" Private Harris asked, his voice tight with fear. Before Reed could respond, the man in front of them stopped once more. He turned to face them, a knowing look in his eyes. "This is it," he said simply. "You have crossed over." The ground beneath them quaked for a split second, and the air seemed to ripple like the surface of water disturbed by a stone. The distant sky darkened unnaturally, casting long shadows over the team. The harsh winds that had swept the desert now turned into a strange, unnatural calm. It was as if time itself had stopped, holding its breath. Reed's team stood frozen, caught between disbelief and awe. The man's words lingered in the air like a challenge, forcing them to question everything they knew. What had they walked into? Where were they? And why did it feel like they were no longer in the world they recognized? "Take another step, and you will never return to what you knew," the man warned, his gaze unwavering. The soldiers stood at the threshold, unsure of what the next move would mean. They could feel the weight of destiny pressing down on them. This was no longer a simple mission. Whatever path they chose now, it would lead them to places they couldn't begin to imagine. As if sensing their hesitation, the man smiled faintly. There is no turning back. But sometimes, the only way forward is through. He turned once again and started walking toward what appeared to be a distant structure rising from the sand. A strange, ancient shape, its silhouette flickering like a mirage, calling to them like a beacon. Reed hesitated, his heart racing. What was it that compelled him to follow this man? What was it about the way he spoke, the strange force in his presence, that made him feel like this was the only choice? "Move out," Reed ordered again, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at his insides. There was no other option. They had to know what lay ahead. And so, they continued to follow the man, leaving the known world behind them as they ventured into the unknown. The desert stretched out before them, endless and unforgiving. The sun beat down mercilessly, casting long shadows that only seemed to deepen the mystery surrounding their guide. The man they had shot, who was now walking ahead of them, unfazed and seemingly untouchable, moved with purpose, as though he knew exactly where he was headed. He didn't look back once. Captain Reed and his team trudged behind him, every step heavy with doubt and uncertainty. There was no going back now. The cryptic words of their guide, "You'll have to believe in something greater than yourselves," echoed in Reed's mind. He had seen many things during his years in the service, but this? This was beyond comprehension. The rest of the team fell into an uneasy silence. They weren't sure if they were following a genius, a madman, or something else entirely. But the weight of the situation pressed down on them, each man feeling the gravity of the unknown. It wasn't just their mission on the line anymore, it was something far bigger than that. One of the younger soldiers, Private Harris, glanced nervously at Reed. "Sir, what's going on? Why isn't he dead? We shot him point blank." Reed didn't have an answer. He only knew that there was something off about the man, something inexplicable, yet undeniable. They had seen soldiers take bullets before, but never like this. There were no signs of life-threatening injury. The man's chest, though riddled with bullet wounds, showed no blood, no sign of trauma. His skin was unmarked, his breath steady, as though the bullets had never even touched him. "Stay focused," Reed snapped, keeping his voice steady despite his own rising unease. "We'll find out soon enough." As they walked, the land around them began to change. The harsh, dry desert ground gradually gave way to a strange, otherworldly terrain. Jagged rocks jutted from the earth, their surfaces glimmering in the sunlight, as though they were made of some material not native to this world. The air felt thicker, heavier, and the temperature seemed to drop despite the sun still blazing high in the sky. Reed felt it before anyone else did, the shift in the atmosphere. It wasn't just the temperature or the strange rocks beneath their feet. It was the feeling that something was watching them. Something, waiting. "What is this place?" Private Harris asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The man ahead of them paused and finally turned to face them. His eyes glinted with a mixture of amusement and something else, something ancient and unfathomable. "This is the threshold," he said, his voice carrying across the stillness. "The beginning of what you've been searching for, but never truly understood." Reed felt his heart skip a beat. The threshold? What was he talking about? As if reading his thoughts, the man continued, "You've spent your lives fighting for survival. Fighting wars. But there's a war far greater than the one you know. A war for the soul of humanity." The words hung in the air, their weight sinking into the minds of the soldiers. A war for the soul of humanity. What did that even mean? The team exchanged uncertain glances, but there was no turning back. The man began walking again, leading them deeper into the strange landscape. After what felt like hours of walking, they reached a clearing. In the center stood a massive structure, an ancient, towering pyramid, unlike anything any of them had ever seen. It was surrounded by glowing symbols, etched into the stone like some forgotten language. The pyramid itself seemed to hum with energy, the air around it crackling with an unseen force. Reed's eyes widened. What is this place? The man stopped in front of the pyramid and turned to face them, his eyes dark with an intensity that sent a shiver down Reed's spine. This is where it all begins. Where your understanding of the world will either shatter or evolve. The man stepped forward and placed his hand on one of the symbols. Instantly, the pyramid's hum grew louder, the ground beneath their feet shaking. Reed's team instinctively reached for their weapons, but the man raised his hand, stopping them. No need for that. You are not the ones in danger. With a sudden burst of energy, the pyramid's stone door creaked open, revealing a glowing interior that seemed to pulse with life. The light from within bathed them all in a soft, ethereal glow, casting long shadows across the desert floor. Reed hesitated. This wasn't part of the mission. This was something else entirely. But the man's calm, unwavering presence made it impossible to refuse. Inside, the man said simply, "Your answers lie within." The team stood at the threshold of the pyramid, a place that seemed to exist outside of time and space. The path ahead was uncertain, but they had no choice but to follow. As they stepped inside, the air grew colder, the weight of their decision pressing down on them. Reed's mind raced. What had they gotten themselves into? What secrets lay hidden in this ancient structure? And more importantly, who was the man leading them here? And why did he say they were not the ones in danger? The instant the light consumed them, Reed felt as though his body had been torn from its earthly bounds. A violent sensation, like an electric pulse, shot through his veins. His vision blurred, and for a brief moment, he thought he might lose consciousness. But then, as quickly as it had come, the sensation was gone. Reed blinked rapidly, trying to focus on his surroundings. The chamber, the platform, and even his own body were gone. In their place, the soldiers found themselves standing in a vast, open expanse, a landscape that stretched endlessly in every direction. The sky above them was unlike anything they had ever seen, no stars, no sun, just a swirling vortex of dark energy, with cracks of brilliant light pulsing through the void. Private Harris gasped, his voice trembling. "Where the hell are we? This isn't real." "It's real," Reed muttered, more to himself than to the team. He had no explanation, but he knew one thing with certainty: they were no longer in the world they knew. This was something entirely new, a realm beyond their comprehension. The man's voice echoed around them, although he was nowhere in sight. "You have crossed over, soldiers. Welcome to the beginning." Reed's heart pounded. The word struck him hard. "The beginning of what?" he shouted into the empty space. "What's happening to us?" The silence stretched on, only to be broken by the distant sound of something moving, something unseen. The ground beneath their feet trembled, and a strange whisper filled the air. It was faint at first, like a distant murmur, but as they listened, it grew louder, an unintelligible language, perhaps a warning, or an invitation. The words didn't make sense, but the emotion they carried was clear: urgency. The unseen forces. Before Reed could react, the air around them shimmered, and figures began to materialize in front of them. At first, they looked like shadows, nothing more than outlines in the air, but then they grew more solid, more defined. They were humanoid, but their features were impossible to make out, too perfect, too unnatural. "We are the keepers," one figure spoke, its voice soft but commanding. "You stand at the crossroads of time, where the laws of your world no longer apply." Reed took a step back, his pulse quickening. "Keepers of what?" "Of the truth," the keeper responded cryptically. "The truth that shapes the future. The truth that defines all existence. Your arrival here is no accident. It has been foretold." Reed's mind raced. "What do you want from us?" The keeper's presence seemed to grow, as though it was watching them, studying them. "We do not want anything from you," it said. "You are the ones who must choose." Will you accept the truth? Will you step beyond your own limitations? Reed glanced at his team, their faces a mixture of fear and confusion. Harris stepped forward, his voice shaky but firm. What happens if we don't? If we refuse? The keeper paused for a long moment before speaking again. Then you return to your world, unchanged. You will remain blind to the forces that govern your reality. But make no mistake, the truth will still exist. It will wait for you, always. Reed's mind was spinning. We don't know what we're dealing with here. We need to understand more. The keeper nodded slowly, as if it anticipated the question. You will. But time here is not the same as time in your world. What you experience in this place may feel like moments, or it may feel like lifetimes. Your perceptions will be tested. With a flick of its hand, the keeper gestured toward the horizon, and the ground began to ripple, shifting like the surface of water disturbed by a stone. In the distance, shapes began to form, distant, yet oddly familiar. They're waiting for you, the keeper said. The world you know is not as it seems. Forces are at work behind the scenes, controlling your destiny. And now, you must decide whether to confront them or turn away. The first trial. Without warning, the world around them shifted once more. The air thickened, and the sky darkened, the swirling vortex above them becoming more chaotic. The ground beneath their feet split open, and strange, mechanical tendrils reached up, grabbing hold of the soldiers and pulling them into the rift. Reed's heart raced as the ground gave way beneath him. He tried to grab onto something, anything, but there was nothing to hold on to. His team was scattered, falling into the darkness. Reed! Harris screamed, his voice echoing in the distance as he fell. Reed's mind was spinning, but he didn't have time to process what was happening. He was falling, tumbling through a void that stretched beyond his understanding. The darkness consumed him completely, and then, nothing. The awakening. The world suddenly snapped back into focus. Reed's breath hitched as he gasped for air, his body jerking as though he had just been revived. The air was cool, and the ground beneath him felt solid, as though the fall had never happened. He stood in what looked like an empty street, surrounded by high-rise buildings that stretched endlessly into the sky. The environment felt disturbingly familiar, but something was off. It wasn't quite real, like a dream, but sharper. Harris stumbled up beside him, wide-eyed, gasping for breath. What just happened? Where are we? Reed's head spun, but he could feel the answer in his bones. This is the first trial, he murmured. It's testing us. The forces behind this world, they're pushing us to see if we're worthy of understanding the truth. The figures of the keepers appeared around them, watching silently as the soldiers regained their bearings. Their gaze was heavy, as if they were waiting for the soldiers to react, to make their next move. You have entered the trial, one keeper said. But remember, the trial is not what it seems. It will challenge you in ways you cannot yet comprehend. The truth is not easily won. Reed swallowed, his mind racing. This wasn't just about survival, it was about something much bigger. Something that could change everything. Are you ready to face what lies ahead? The keeper asked, its voice now filled with an unspoken gravity. Reed met its gaze, steady and determined. We'll face whatever it takes. Reed and his team were standing in an unfamiliar, hauntingly quiet cityscape. The high-rise buildings seemed to stretch into infinity, their surfaces sleek and polished, but devoid of any life. The streets were empty, the air still. Nothing stirred. The strange, dark vortex above them still pulsed ominously in the sky, casting an eerie light over the environment. The sense of unreality hung heavy in the air. Private Harris was the first to break the silence. What are we supposed to do here? He asked, his voice wavering. Reed could feel the weight of the keeper's eyes on them, but he didn't have an answer. The world around them seemed to pulse with anticipation, like it was waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. One of the keepers spoke, its voice reverberating in the stillness. Your trial begins now. This world is a reflection of your deepest fears. Confront them, and you will unlock the next phase of your journey. Fail, and you will be lost. Reed's stomach twisted. He had expected challenges, but this was different. There was something about this place that felt like it was reaching into his soul, questioning everything he thought he knew. He tried to steady his breath, but the fear gnawed at him. What exactly are we supposed to confront? The keeper didn't answer directly. Instead, it gestured towards the city. Explore. The trial will reveal itself to you. Unveiling the truth. Reluctantly, the soldiers began to move. The city was vast, and yet there was no sign of life anywhere. It felt like a ghost town, but not quite, a city that was alive, but frozen, as if suspended in time. As they walked down the streets, a sense of isolation settled over them. Their footsteps echoed too loudly, bouncing off the glassy surfaces of the buildings. Each soldier was deep in thought, but they couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched by something far beyond their comprehension. Reed's mind raced. Could this place be a manifestation of their fears? Were these streets a reflection of their own psyches, warped by some unknown force? His thoughts were interrupted when something unexpected happened. Without warning, the environment began to shift. The streets that had seemed so still moments ago began to move, subtle at first, then more pronounced. Buildings flickered, and the cityscape itself began to melt, warping like a piece of paper being dipped into water. It was as if reality itself was breaking apart. Then, in the distance, Reed saw a figure, a woman, standing at the edge of an alleyway. She was watching them, her face hidden in shadow. Despite the surreal nature of the city, her presence felt tangible, real. Instinctively, Reed started to move towards her, his feet dragging him forward, though part of him felt uneasy. His mind screamed at him to stay away, but his legs refused to listen. He was compelled to go closer, to understand more about this place and what it meant. The woman took a step forward, revealing her face. Reed froze. The woman was him. The mirror of the mind. His heart skipped a beat. He stepped back, blinking rapidly, certain that his mind was playing tricks on him. But when he looked again, the woman remained the same, his own face staring back at him. Harris was the first to speak. What the hell is going on? Reed, is that? It's me, Reed whispered, the words barely leaving his mouth. But it can't be. The woman, his reflection, smiled softly, her eyes filled with a deep, unsettling understanding. You've come a long way, Reed. But this is where your journey truly begins. You are not just facing a trial. You're facing yourself. Reed took a shaky breath. What do you want from me? I want you to face the truth, the woman replied. The truth about yourself. The one you've hidden deep inside. The truth unraveled. Suddenly, the world around them shifted once more. The cityscape disintegrated, replaced by a forest, a dense, shadowy place filled with towering trees and a thick fog that clung to the ground. The air was heavy with the scent of decay. A chill ran down Reed's spine as the surroundings seemed to close in on him. Where are we now? Private Harris asked, his voice tinged with fear. The woman spoke again, her voice echoing in the thick fog. This is where the truth will be revealed. Follow me, if you dare. Reed hesitated, but something in him urged him forward. He didn't know what this place was, but he had no choice but to walk into it. His team followed, their steps slow, unsure of what they might find next. As they moved deeper into the fog, the woman, his reflection, led them toward an opening in the trees. The ground was uneven, and Reed stumbled, catching himself just in time. The air felt suffocating, and yet there was an undeniable pull to move forward. They finally arrived at the clearing. In the center of the clearing stood a massive stone altar, ancient and worn. On top of the altar were objects, scraps of old memories, things Reed recognized from his past, his childhood, his family, his mistakes. Each object seemed to glow with an otherworldly light, casting long shadows across the stone. "This is the altar of truth," the woman said softly. "Here, you will face the choices you've made, the lies you've told yourself, and the man you've become." Reed's heart pounded in his chest. He knew this was a test, but he didn't know how to face it. His own fears, his own failures, were laid bare in front of him. He had spent so much of his life running from them, burying them deep inside. But now, in this strange place, there was no escaping. "You must accept what you have been," the woman urged. "Only then can you move forward." Reed's legs trembled, but he stepped forward, his hand reaching out to touch one of the glowing objects on the altar. As his fingers made contact, memories flooded his mind, memories he had long tried to forget. A choice to make. The memories were painful, moments of betrayal, of regret, of failure. He remembered the soldiers who had died under his command, the lives lost because of his decisions. He remembered the fear that had driven him to become someone he wasn't, someone who hid behind a mask of strength, afraid to show weakness. But as the memories poured into him, something shifted. He could feel the weight of it all, but with it came an understanding, a clarity. He had lived with these ghosts for so long, but now, facing them head-on, he realized that they didn't define him. They were part of his story, but they didn't have to control his future. The woman, his reflection, nodded, as if she understood. "You have seen what you needed to see. Now, you must decide, will you continue to hide, or will you embrace who you truly are?" Reed's breath caught in his throat. This was the moment that would determine everything. He had faced his fears, confronted his past, and now it was time to move forward. "I choose to embrace it," Reed whispered, his voice steady for the first time in ages. The moment Reed uttered the words, "I choose to embrace it," everything around him seemed to shift. The stone altar cracked, glowing brightly before shattering like glass. The fog lifted, revealing a vast, open sky above them, but it wasn't the sky of Earth. The stars twinkled with an unfamiliar brilliance, the colors in the air vibrant and shifting like an ever-changing kaleidoscope. The woman, his reflection, faded, her figure dissolving into the air, as if it had never been there at all. But Reed could feel her presence lingering inside him. Her words echoed in his mind. He had faced the darkest corners of his soul and come to terms with his past, but the journey wasn't over. This place had shown him what he was capable of, but now he had to prove it. Harris looked around in confusion. "What just happened? What did you do?" I made a choice," Reed replied, his voice heavy with realization. The air felt different now, lighter, almost as though a burden had been lifted from his shoulders. He had embraced his past, not as a source of shame but as a foundation upon which to build his future. But the battle was far from over. He could feel it, a presence, watching, waiting for the next move. The trial was still unfolding, and the stakes had only grown higher. The shift in perspective. "Keep moving," Reed ordered, his voice steady but filled with urgency. The cityscape had vanished, replaced once again by a new environment, this time, a barren wasteland stretching as far as the eye could see. The ground beneath them was cracked and scorched, a harsh reminder of the destructive forces at work in this trial. As they moved forward, a strange buzzing sound filled the air, growing louder with each step. Reed's hand instinctively went to his sidearm, but there was no enemy in sight. Instead, he saw what looked like large, metallic insects rising from the ground, their bodies made of sharp, gleaming metal. They hovered above the ground, scanning the area with glowing red eyes. "They're coming," Harris muttered, his eyes wide with fear. "They're not real," Reed replied, though his voice trembled slightly. He couldn't help but feel a sense of dread creep into his chest. These creatures weren't part of the world they knew. This was a test, an illusion, but it didn't make it any less terrifying. The buzzing grew louder, and the insects began to swarm toward them. Without hesitation, Reed raised his weapon, ready to fire, but before he could make a move, one of the creatures darted forward and landed directly in front of him. Its glowing red eyes locked onto his, and Reed felt a jolt of energy shoot through him, like a wave of electricity coursing through his veins. The creature spoke, its voice a strange, distorted hum that reverberated in his mind. "You have faced your past, soldier. But now you must face your future. Will you fight for what you believe in, or will you falter when the time comes?" Reed gritted his teeth. "I'll fight." The insect's eyes flashed, and it shot back into the swarm. The air was thick with tension as the creatures circled around them. They were testing him again, but this time, the stakes felt even higher. The struggle within. As the swarm descended, Reed's mind raced. He had faced his past, he had acknowledged his mistakes, his fears, and his weaknesses. But now, this trial was forcing him to confront something far more difficult, his own future. What did he stand for? What was he fighting for? The team moved quickly, taking cover behind the remnants of destroyed buildings, but the metallic insects were relentless. Reed's heart was pounding in his chest, but he pushed through the fear, focusing on the task at hand. These creatures, these tests, weren't meant to break him. They were meant to force him to make a choice. As the swarm closed in, Reed's thoughts turned to his soldiers, the men and women who followed him, trusted him. They depended on him. He couldn't falter now. Not when everything was on the line. With a roar of defiance, Reed leapt from cover, firing his weapon into the swarm. The insects scattered momentarily, but they quickly regrouped, surrounding him from all sides. It was a battle of wills now, not just against the creatures, but against the doubts that had plagued him for so long. He had been afraid of failure, afraid of letting his team down. But in that moment, as he faced the swarm, something inside him shifted. He was no longer running from his fears. He was charging toward them. A moment of clarity. In the chaos of battle, Reed heard something he didn't expect. A voice, soft, but unmistakably clear, echoed in his mind. "You are not alone." It was the voice of his mother, the woman who had always believed in him, even when he didn't believe in himself. Her words were like a beacon, guiding him through the storm. He had never truly understood the power of family, of connection, until now. He was fighting not just for himself, but for them, for the ones who loved him, who had always been there when he needed them most. In that moment, Reed's perception shifted. The swarm wasn't just an enemy, it was a reflection of his inner turmoil. His doubts, his fears, and his insecurities had taken physical form, and now it was time to face them. The metallic insects surged forward again, but this time, Reed didn't hesitate. He stepped forward, not with fear, but with conviction. His gun roared to life, and one by one, the insects fell. But as each one dropped, another appeared in its place, seemingly endless. "Enough," Reed muttered under his breath. He wasn't going to fight this battle with violence. He was going to win it with his mind, by confronting the true enemy, himself. A test of will. Reed lowered his weapon, staring down the next wave of insects. His team watched in confusion, unsure of what he was doing, but Reed knew that he had to trust his instincts. He closed his eyes, taking a deep breath, and focused on his inner self. The battle wasn't about defeating the swarm, it was about overcoming the doubts that had plagued him for so long. The swarm hesitated, as if sensing his resolve. For the first time, Reed felt a shift in the air. The buzzing faded, and the creatures stopped moving. One by one, they fell to the ground, deactivated. Reed opened his eyes, and the world around him shifted again. The barren wasteland vanished, replaced by a warm, golden light. The metallic insects were gone, and in their place stood the keepers, watching silently. "You have passed the test," one of the keepers said, its voice resonating through the air. Reed exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of the trial lift from his shoulders. "I've faced my fears," he said, his voice steady, but filled with emotion. "Now, I can face whatever comes next." The golden light faded, and Reed found himself standing at the edge of an immense precipice. Below, a vast chasm stretched out into nothingness, its depth infinite, as though the very ground had been torn apart by some unseen force. The air was thick with an otherworldly silence, and the world around him seemed suspended in time. Harris and the rest of the team appeared beside him, their faces a mixture of confusion and awe. They had all witnessed Reed's transformation, but none of them understood what was truly happening. Reed could feel their eyes on him, but his focus was drawn to the dark figure standing at the other side of the chasm, waiting for him. It was the same figure he had seen before, back in the city. The one who had taunted him, who had tried to break his spirit. But now, it wasn't just a reflection. It was real. It was the manifestation of his deepest fear, the fear of failure, the fear of never being good enough. "You've come far, soldier," the figure said, its voice echoing across the chasm, carrying a weight that pressed down on Reed's chest. "But you've still not faced the hardest part." Reed's heart raced, but he stood firm. "I'm not afraid of you anymore." The figure smirked, stepping forward, its shape blurring and shifting as though it was made of smoke and shadows. "You don't understand, do you? The real battle isn't out here. It's within you." Reed's breath caught in his throat as the figure raised its hand, and the ground beneath them began to tremble. The chasm widened, and a violent wind whipped around them, threatening to tear everything apart. It was as if the very fabric of reality was unraveling before their eyes. But Reed didn't flinch. He had faced his past. He had fought his fears. And now, he had to face the final test, the battle for his own soul. The internal struggle. The moment the figure's hand dropped, the world around Reed shifted again. The wind died, and the chasm closed, leaving him standing on solid ground. But now, he was alone. The others were gone, and Reed found himself in an empty, vast expanse, a place that felt both familiar and foreign. And then, the whispers began. At first, they were soft, just a murmur, like a distant breeze. But soon, they grew louder, each voice carrying the weight of every doubt, every regret, every mistake Reed had ever made. They were his fears, his failures, his insecurities, echoing in his mind. "You're not strong enough," one voice said, a sharp, biting tone. "You'll never be the leader they need. You've failed them before," another whispered, its tone laced with venom. "You'll fail them again." Reed clutched his head, trying to block out the voices, but they only grew louder. They weren't just words, they were his deepest fears, his guilt, and his shame, taking shape in his mind. The darkness swirled around him, threatening to consume him entirely. But then, something shifted. The memories, those painful, haunting memories, no longer had the power to control him. He had confronted his past, and now, it no longer defined him. The whispers began to fade, replaced by a single, clear thought. "I am more than my past." Reed's grip on his own mind tightened. He had been living in the shadow of his mistakes for so long, but now, he understood. His past didn't have to define his future. The failures, the guilt, the doubts, they could all stay in the past. He was no longer that man. He stood tall, facing the darkness that had once consumed him. The figure that had taunted him, the manifestation of all his fears, appeared before him once more. "You still can't escape me," it sneered. "You are nothing without your regrets." Reed's eyes burned with newfound clarity. "I am everything because of them." The unseen strength. The figure recoiled, as if it had never expected those words to come from him. Reed stepped forward, his every movement sure and deliberate. The darkness that had once seemed so overwhelming no longer had power over him. He was no longer afraid of the past. He was no longer afraid of the failures that had once defined him. With a cry of defiance, Reed lunged at the figure, his hands gripping the air as if he could physically tear it apart. And in that moment, the figure vanished. The darkness lifted, replaced by a brilliant light. Reed found himself standing in the midst of a vibrant, lush landscape, a stark contrast to the desolate world he had just been in. He was no longer alone. Harris and the rest of the team stood around him, their expressions filled with awe and wonder. "You did it," Harris said, his voice filled with reverence. "You faced it, all of it." Reed looked around, his chest swelling with pride. It wasn't just a victory over the trials he had faced. It was a victory over himself. The life-altering realization. Reed turned to face the team, a quiet smile crossing his face. "I didn't just face my past. I faced my future, too. It's not about winning or losing. It's about fighting for what you believe in, even when it feels impossible." The ground beneath them began to shake once more, but this time, the team wasn't afraid. Reed had shown them that even in the darkest moments, there was always a way forward. His journey wasn't just about survival, it was about transformation. As the light enveloped them, a new world began to take shape before their eyes. This world was different, a world where anything was possible. "You've earned your place," a voice from the keepers spoke from the distance. "You have proven yourself worthy." Reed smiled, but it wasn't a smile of relief. It was a smile of understanding. The trial had not just tested his strength, it had tested his will to change, to evolve, and to fight for something greater than himself. And now, he was ready for whatever came next. As the team stood in the newly formed world, the air crackled with energy, and Reed could feel the weight of what he had accomplished. The trials, the endless battles with his own mind, had all led him to this moment. It wasn't just about the destination, it was about the journey. Every step had brought him closer to this understanding, that true power wasn't found in the things you conquered, but in the things you learned along the way. The world around them shifted again, though this time, it wasn't a threat. It was an invitation. The ground began to form itself into a pathway, a glowing, golden trail leading toward an ancient structure in the distance, a massive, towering temple that seemed to be made of both stone and light. This was the heart of the trial, the place where everything had been leading. "You're not finished yet," the voice of the keepers echoed, resonating in the air around them. "This is your final test." Reed took a deep breath. He knew this wasn't about more fighting. It wasn't about defeating an enemy or surviving another challenge. This time, it was about understanding. The Temple of Truth. As they entered the temple, the air was thick with a sense of ancient knowledge. The walls were covered in intricate carvings, stories of heroes and kings, of battles and triumphs. But among them, there were also stories of failure, loss, and despair. These stories weren't meant to inspire, at least not in the way Reed had expected. They weren't about glory. They were about the fragility of life, the imperfections that make a person human. At the center of the temple was a large stone altar, its surface smooth and black, reflecting the light from above. Reed approached it cautiously, his mind still processing the overwhelming sense of understanding that had flooded him. Harris stood beside him, equally awestruck, though no one spoke. The air itself seemed to hold its breath. Then, a soft voice, as clear as if it was standing right next to him, spoke. "Look at what you've learned, Reed. Look at what you've become." Reed's eyes scanned the altar. It wasn't just a structure, it was a mirror, reflecting his own image. But not just his physical form. This was a reflection of his entire journey, everything he had been through, every lesson he had learned. His face was older, his eyes tired, but there was a quiet strength in them now, a strength forged in the fires of his struggles. And then, the voice spoke again, not as a challenge, but as a question. "What will you do with this strength?" Reed's heart raced as he pondered the question. He had faced so much. He had fought battles, both external and internal. He had won the fight for his soul, for his peace. But this was something different. The question wasn't about victory, it was about purpose. The realization.